On behalf of the board, welcome and thank you for attending. Your support and continued membership in the MIABC allows us to maintain our efforts to provide you with the exceptional speakers for our webinars, free of charge to our membership, and to offer some of those intimate and interactive 10 and 10 series of events that we've launched this year. Before we dive into today's event, we'd like to remind everyone of some of the upcoming events that we have. In addition to today's fantastic webinar for you, we have on Thursday, May 27th at noon, in honor of Asian Heritage Month, we are hosting our very own Andy Pham in a special session titled Asian Canadians United in Diversity. And then soon to be posted on Tuesday, June 8th at noon as well, the leasing panel with CBRE and Altus discussing the office and retail sectors and what is going on in those particular markets. And also that will be posted soon on Tuesday, July 13th, the MIABC will be hosting its annual AGM and also corresponding webinar. And we look forward to an exciting announcement on that one as well. While we're not there yet to run a golf tournament, we are looking forward to bringing that back in 2022. There's been some great progress on the public health front, but it's just deemed appropriate to defer till next year. We look forward to welcoming you to these upcoming events. Watch your inbox and check the website. And now, without further ado, for today's webinar, allow me to thank CMLS Financial for their generous sponsorship, and I'll hand it over to Sam Brown, SVP of CMLS, to introduce the session today. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham.
So on behalf of CMLS Financial, delighted to sponsor today's session with Howie and David. Graham told me I have 3 minutes for a commercial, 180 seconds. Which I would argue is about 150 seconds too long. I can't remember the last time I paid attention to a commercial longer than 30 seconds. So maybe I'll give back 2.5 minutes to everyone's day here and simply say this. At CMLS, we originate, adjudicate, fund, service, and otherwise manage commercial mortgage investments on behalf of predominantly institutional mortgage investors. And in that capacity, we face the market as a lender. We also have a growing advisory arm where we act on behalf of our borrower clients. And between these activities, lending and brokerage, we're active across nearly all asset classes, strategies, markets, terms, and across the capital stack. All told, we account for roughly 10% of the commercial mortgage market in Canada. So, whether you're a commercial real estate capital provider or a commercial real estate capital user, we're here to help. And maybe with that, I will turn it over to the main event and make some introductions. So on my left right now, we have Howie Charters, Vice President with Colliers International Consulting. Howie joined Colliers 25 years ago and founded its consulting practice with over 35 years experience in both the public and private sector. His expertise includes strategic advisory services for the development of mixed-use commercial projects, the rationalization of complex portfolios, and perhaps most importantly, or indeed most importantly for the topic at hand here today, over the past 15 years, Howie has worked with 16 First Nations governments and members in BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Arizona to assist them with economic development initiatives. And to my right, we have David Negrin, CEO of MST Development Corporation, which of course is a joint venture between the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. David has over 30 years of extensive experience in the development of residential and commercial real estate, including master plans projects. And in addition to his role with MST Development Corporation, he's also the CEO of Apollo Management Inc., a development consultant for and former president of Aquilini Development and Construction, and is the chief negotiator for the Lax Lambs Band of Prince Rupert. So maybe with that, Howie, David, I will hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you. I'll lead off. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. And I want to give you my thoughts on 3 areas of interest: the types of opportunities that present themselves with First Nations, the types of First Nations interests that you'll be delving into, and the types of land administration governance models. And then perhaps as we move along, give some examples of actual active projects on the ground. I've been working with First Nations for over 16 years, and really they're quite diverse, from small rural nations like Dog Creek outside of Williams Lake to the more sophisticated First Nations in Metro Vancouver, and the Pima First Nations in Chandler, Arizona. And you can appreciate this diversity manifests itself in the nation's governance, their politics, the resource base, the economic development opportunities, and that influences how you really engage with them. The economic opportunities for rural nations is primarily natural resource based, whereas the urban nations are real estate development based because of the value of urban real estate. And my work has been primarily focused on the latter. The types of opportunities are really divided into twofold, and those are ones that occur on Indian reservations, Canada Crown lands, and then those that occur off reserve. On the reserve, there's two types of interests you deal with. There's the actual members of the nation, and they hold a form of title in these reserves, and it's known as a certificate of possession. And it's very similar to titles that any of you would have in real estate, except it can only be conveyed from one First Nations member to another in terms of title, and it would have to be leased to outsiders who wanted to develop on the lands. And then there's those portions of the reserve that's actually owned by the nation. The unreserved freehold lands are subject to local government rules and regulations and processes, and First Nations operate on those lands very similar to you and I. The administrative processes on the reserved lands, they have a registry very similar to the BC Land Registry. It's known as the Federal Indian Land Registration. That's administered by Natural Resources Canada, and it operates almost identical. Leases are registered, subdivisions are registered, mortgages are securitized against the title, and they're relatively efficient in terms of their processing, and they process their applications within 3 to 4 weeks, and those are usually submitted on behalf of the lessee and the lessor by the Indian band. In terms of governance models, there's a number that are in play, and some better than others, as you can imagine. Band lands that are under Indian and Northern Affairs Administration are probably the most difficult to deal with, and that the nation has literally no self-government or control over their lands. And everything that you attempt to do or get approved must go through Ottawa, and it can take a very, very long period of time, and frankly makes it difficult both for the members of the First Nations community and bringing about change and improvement, as well as quite frustrating for people who are trying to work with them. There has been some changes over the years, and they have a regime which is known as land code, and First Nations or Indian bands can go through a process very similar to creating an area plan in a municipality, and they go through that process, have it voted on, and then it is approved by Indian Affairs, and they now have autonomy in terms of approving transactions on the land, approving land use changes, leases, development plans, and what have you. The federal government still will have an overarching regulatory role in terms of the usual environmental restrictions and concerns. They also have to work with local government in terms of providing access to civil infrastructure. You have another, and there are very few of them, but you have another category, which are self-government lands, and it's created through legislation. In British Columbia, Sechelt, West Bank, and Soyuz are self-governing nations, and they have complete autonomy on how they operate their property or their lands, which they have just about all of the authorities that a treaty nation has, but they're not a treaty nation. And of course, that's the fourth one, of which I think we have probably 14 or 15 or more in British Columbia that have treaties. The one that everyone's probably most familiar with is Tsawwassen First Nation in Delta, which is operated quite successfully since they got their treaty signed off about 10 years ago. And you can see the changes that have occurred down there over that period of time. Within that governance framework, there's sort of what I would call operational governance. And the traditional model is economic development is part of the mainstream governance and is similar and must compete with other government for attention and resourcing. And it's very similar to businesses that municipalities attempt to operate. Some of them with some success, others not quite so successful. But the separation of this business from politics, there was a University of Harvard developed a model that was based on the tribal system in the United States that is quite easily adapted to Canada, and a number of nations have adopted it. And basically what they do is set up a separate corporate entity for economic development that has an independent board, professional management that is separate from the political chief and band council that governs the community. And it's probably similar to the improvement in effectiveness that one will see with the establishment of crown corporations versus government departments. When I'm looking at working with First Nations, that's probably the key element I look at is what sort of governance do they have? And it pretty much dictates how successful the engagement is going to be. What I've discovered is that in attempting to work with those First Nations that operate under the traditional model, although you do have some success, you can really get bogged down in band politics, and it becomes quite unpredictable. Also, the length of time it takes to get anything done also becomes quite onerous. So people who attempt to do business with some First Nations that don't have a good governance model will get frustrated and disillusioned. Examples of those nations in BC that I feel are good examples of successful governance are Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Soyuz, West Bank, Sechelt, Tsawwassen, Chetkin, Chilliwack, McLeod Lake, Hesla, and Kitimat. And there are probably a few others. We do find similar governance occurring in other provinces in Canada, and certainly in the United States as well. So what I'll do at this point is perhaps turn it over to David, and he can carry on with his experience in many aspects of working with First Nations. So, David, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Howie, and welcome everybody here today. It's a little bit strange doing these talks looking into a computer screen. It seems very difficult and dry at times, but it's the way the world is today. I guess I always go back to one of the first experiences I had working with a First Nation. I was involved with Patronus and the Laxwalam Nation up north. I'd been asked by the province of British Columbia to see if I could help get the pipeline, which is the LNG pipeline, up north. I was asked by the Liberal government, and I was in a meeting with about 300 band members, and I was introducing myself and really talking about the benefits that the nations could have. And then about a half hour into the meeting, I thought I was doing really well, and one of the people stood up, one of the nations stood up, and he said, I've got a name for you. And I said, oh, that's nice. He says, yeah, we're going to call you Walking Eagle. And I thought, well, that's nice. This is going well. And he said, you're so full of crap, you can't fly. And I learned a lesson immediately that nothing is what you think it is. And there's a lot of politics in First Nations that you have to deal with. But as long as you're straightforward with them, and as long as you can deliver what they require, and there's many different deliveries with First Nations. It's not just about, I'll tell you this, the least of the nations is about money. It's about culture, it's about heritage, and it's about the membership and the people, and bringing health, housing, and prosperity to those nations. That's really what my job is as CEO with MSTDC. A little bit of my background. I started with Concord Pacific in 1988 and was with them 20 years. And then I went over to Aquiline in 2007 and was involved with a number of developments there. And in 2015, I'd been working with a number of nations through the Aquiline group in Vancouver, and the nations asked if I'd come over and be CEO. And that was only 4 years ago. And I just wanted to stress how there's been such a change in terms of governments dealing with First Nations. And we have 4 major projects in Vancouver now that we're currently working on, and we're in the zoning stages in some, and a couple of the zoning's just about finished. But we have Wellington and Burnaby, and that's currently in zoning, and that's about 4 million square feet of mixed-use development. We also have the LDB, Liquor Distribution Branch, and that is going to be about 1.25 million square feet. 2.150 million square feet. And we're really hoping, we're in negotiations with the city right now to move that from a light industrial site to light industrial, retail, and rental and social housing. And then we have the Fairmont site in 37th and Heather. We're in for zoning right now, and we're doing approximately 2.8 million square feet of mixed-use development. And then everybody knows the Jericho Lands. We have the Jericho East Lands. We have a partnership with Canada Land Corporation right now. We will be taking Canada Land Corporation out of that deal and owning it 100%. And we also have the Jericho West Lands that we negotiated with the province of British Columbia. And we have about, between the 2 sites there, we're going to end up with about 10 to 12 million square feet. And then the last site we're dealing with right now is the West Van Fisheries site. And we're in the first phase of that, and that's about 200,000 square feet. So if you look at the nations now, we have over 21 million square feet that we're currently involved with, and we're going to bring it to fruition. And just to give you an idea, that's twice the size of Concord Pacific. So if you really look at the nations now, they are one of the top developers in Canada and will continue to be. And I can tell you that we're also negotiating on 4 other large sites in Vancouver right now. We're under an NDA with the governments, but these are massive sites and very, very, I would say, important sites in Vancouver. When you work with First Nations, you start first with government negotiations. And those government negotiations are extremely difficult. And, how did MST Nations become one of the top developers in Canada? I can tell you it was through patience. I've only been with the nations, I've worked with nations for over 27 years, but in this job, I've only been 4 years. And you have to realize that the nations here have been waiting hundreds of years to get their lands back. So patience is the word that brought this to fruition for the First Nations. And when did it change? And this is a belief I have, and it's a belief that many of my owners have, is that in the late 1990s, many of the nations in Canada decided to go to court to get back their lands. And there was one major court case, and it was a Chilcotin court case that took place in British Columbia. And it was, and it still is, a landmark decision of the Supreme Court of Canada that the nations had rights and titles to their lands. At that point, this decision came down in 2014. And really, from my perspective, in 2014, that's when the negotiations really kicked in with provincial governments, municipal governments, and the federal government to bring lands back to nations that were their land. And as a result, the province has had to engage in meaningful consultation now with my clients, and as title holders, recognize that they are the title holders to these lands. There's also a very positive effect for the nations for both the provincial and federal crown lands. So it's really the crown lands that we've been negotiating with the governments on. And of course, these are large parcels of land and will bring great success to the nations. Decision really opened a door for nations to go back and really take the land. They also tell me that they're taking their land back, and they use those words, they're taking it back, because it's been too long that we've had to wait. So MST DC, which is the company I represent, we started negotiations with the province of British Columbia and the federal government of Canada in 2015. And again, I've said, I believe that the result of the Chilcotin decision heavily impacted the path for both the province and federal governments that they had to take. They knew if they were going to take on the nations, that it was highly unlikely that they would win the court cases. And there's not been one major, I think maybe there was one just a year ago, but up until then, there wasn't one Supreme Court decision that did not go in favor of the First Nations. So governments had to fix the wrongs and they had to make them right. And that was an advantage for the nations to move forward. Therefore, the door was open for MST to commence its negotiations with both the federal and provincial governments on the Willingdon lands, the LDB lands, the Fairmont lands, and the Jericho lands. I can tell you that these negotiations are difficult, to say the least. Many governments still believe that the land is theirs and that they should sell it back to the nations. And I can tell you that all the deals that we've done so far, we've had to pay for the land. It's been through heavy negotiations, prolonged negotiations, that a deal structure for the nations to receive these lands back at a discounted price with an accommodation value. This is very important. Under the deals we do with the federal government, we cannot state what we purchased the land for, but I can tell you it's very much below market value. And also through recognition and accommodation, that we get an accommodation when we purchase this land. So if the land was $100, typically we get about $30 of that as an accommodation that we don't have to pay for it. And therefore, again, it's a reduced land price, number one, and number two, we do get an accommodation. So in the development industry, that puts us in an advantage, because I can tell you that our land costs on our major developments come out at about $52 per square foot. That's for Willingdon, LDB, Jericho, and Fairmont. So we believe that we can play in this market under any condition that the economy may be in. And that's a real advantage. And truthfully, I believe the nations, they deserve that. We continue to work with the federal and provincial governments on substantial land deals in the Lower Mainland, and fully anticipate that these lands will be returned to the nations within the next 2 years. I also believe that the success of the MST nations has had sort of the nations, where the success has been with the three nations, and Howie, you touched on this, is that these three nations came together. And it was extremely important they came together, because governments saw these three nations of always battling each other for rights entitled to lands they believed that were theirs and not the other nations. So my clients came together, and this was number one in terms of the success that we've had. I can tell you that when I worked at Concord Pacific or Aquini, I was heavily involved in making the deals. My clients are at the table, and they're the reason that we're getting the deals we want. It's not my team or myself. It's the nations that sit at the table and basically demand the zones that they'd like and the successes that they're going to have. Without the MST nations backing, I can tell you that MST Development Corporation would not be successful. So the nations, make no mistake, the nations are business people. They fully understand where they are started, they fully understand what they're doing, and they fully understand where they're going to end up. Currently the Liberal federal government recognizes the rights and titles of First Nations across Canada, but as we all know, governments change. And so I always say to my clients, I do believe we only have a 3 to 5 year window here to draw down the lands that were previously First Nations, because with new governments coming in, and also the governments are realizing that there's only so much they can do financially in terms of making these deals work. And so I really believe that this window is going to be more difficult for all the nations across Canada than what we're seeing right now. We'll continue our path to negotiate, and hopefully that we can finish off our negotiations with these lands as quickly as possible. That's external governance, internal governance, and Howie, you touched on that too. MSTDC, the company I represent, we have a board, and it's made up of 2 members of each nation. The mandate I was given when I started in 2016 was very clear, and it's as follows: no financial risk to the nation. That was number 1. And I thought, well, how the hell am I going to do deals here if there's no financial risk that's going to come to the nations? As little cash requirements as possible, no guarantees required by each nation. And the most important one, never give up our land and continue to acquire our lands back from the provincial and federal governments. Ensure First Nations people are offered good opportunities for employment and education. Ensure we, the nations, become self-sufficient. You told me, David, you have a sunset in this company because we want you to educate us that we can have our own people run these projects. And I can tell you the other misnomer is that the nation's people, there's a lot of these younger people now in school as lawyers, moving into architecture, moving into engineering. They will become self-sufficient. And so, that's, let's say, another sort of falsehood that the nations don't want to do this. Make no mistake, they will become self-sufficient. So when you have those as a mandate, when you're a CEO, you say to yourself, well, how am I going to get this done? And we realized that we had to develop these lands so that the nations would never lose the lands. And so we had many discussions with governments on how we're going to put this deal together. So when we came with the deals, and I'll explain how the deals did come together, but when we brought the deals to the nations, I had to first go back to the board, and the board had to approve it. After the board, I had to go to chief, chair, and councils and make sure they approved it. And I can tell you the most important approval in a First Nation is membership. Chiefs, chairs, and councils change. In some nations every 2 years, in other nations 4 years. So you need that membership to vote so that when those chiefs and chairs and councillors move on and new councillors come in, they can't change the deal. And this has been historically an issue with developers, outside developers coming in with First Nations. And so the MST nations made it very clear, get rid of the politics and just do the development. Development and politics don't mix. And I can tell you that they've been not 100% successful, but they've probably been 90% successful in keeping that. So the hurdles we faced, again, I'll go through it. No financial risk, as little cash as possible, no guarantees, and never give up our land. How did we put that together? Well, one hurdle we immediately faced was MST and Canada Land Corporation were 50-50 partners in Jericho East and Fairmont. So I started negotiations with Bob Howell and his group at Canada Lands Corporation. And we did a deal where we're buying the lands back. And pretty much to the price, the exact same price that we paid with Canada Land. And so therefore, we're going to have the land rezoned, and we're not going to pay for the land until we've enacted our zoning in phases. That was really important because even though we're not paying high land costs, these are still large projects. You can imagine what they're worth. I can tell you that Jericho West is a $480 million deal. And overall, the deal on all these sites is over $1.2 billion. So we need to figure out, how do we get this done? The other problem we faced is that we did not have the financial capability for the permitting and zoning. And so we thought, okay, what we're going to do is we put an RFP out to 13 developers and major developers in Vancouver. We were bringing a partner in. And that partnership was going to be 25% the partner and 25% each nation. So Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh hold 25%, and our developer partner will hold 25%. The project would be based on a 99-year lease. Therefore, for my clients, they never lose their land. At the end of 99 years, the $300 that land is returned to my client on all the deals. That's Willingdon, LDB, Fairmont, and Jericho. What we discovered is that leases up at SFU, lease land at SFU, and lease land at UBC was selling at a discounted price of maybe 10%. And I don't believe today that it's even 10% discount. So that's how we kept the land for the nation. Therefore, our projects are based on a 99-year lease, and they're returned at the end of that lease. The partner paid the government the accommodation, right? So the government gave our nations an accommodation. The partner comes in and he pays that accommodation back to the nations up front, so the nations have some money to go on and do other projects. And the partner puts up all the guarantees and all the cash that's required, but he can use the land. Because our land costs are so low, we don't have much mortgage against the land, and the partner can use it. So this is how we got our nations a successful deal. Was number one, we do a 99-year lease. Number two, the partner puts up all the cash and the guarantees required. But that partner is buying in at roughly a 30% land cost of what the land is worth. So again, this has been a good model for us, and we're going to continue to use that model as we move on to other lands. The partner also has to ensure procurement and jobs for the First Nations. I can tell you between Jericho and Fairmont, there's over $20 million that goes to the nations in order to educate in schools and also as an apprenticeship with many of the sub-trades that are located in Vancouver. The partner provides scholarships for the First Nations members also. There's a number of scholarships that are given out to each nation, younger people to go to school. And then what we do is the project proceeds on a phased enactment and the land costs are paid back to both the federal and provincial government, only paid at a phased enactment. So on Jericho, we'll have 6 phases. We only pay that initial cost back to the governments over that phase, each phase. And what that does is it allows us to zone the land, and as all of you would know, that land is worth much more zoned than it is unzoned. And therefore, we can borrow against the land with our partner because he's putting up the guarantees and he's putting up all the cash. It's easier for him and it's easier for us because we're now zoned. So it's been a really exciting time for MST, DC, and the First Nations. And we really look forward to continuing on. And I would hope by this year, by the end of this year, that we're up to over 30 million square feet in ownership of lands throughout the Lower Mainland. And the last thing I'll say is the other thing we learned is that there's a number of government subsidies for First Nations through grants and loans. I started a company called Isthmus, and that company goes out and it obtains loans and grants from the federal and provincial governments. And so far, what's called an innovative fund, we've raised $15 million. That's a grant that we can use for all the soft costs and projects that we're going to move forward on. And an example, West Vancouver is a project that we're doing on our own, and we're going to use that money to do all the soft costs and move towards the sale of the project. We also, with CMHC, there's a number of funds available for First Nations. We've raised over $350 million for the social housing and rental projects that we're doing on Fairmont and Jericho. Those subsidies will be paid out to the nations as we develop that. And again, what we're doing is we're addressing the housing needs in Vancouver, social housing needs and the rental needs. And then there's called an FLI fund, and that's a federal land initiative fund that the nations, when we buy our land, the nations fund a portion of that. Example being, this is public knowledge. In Fairmont, we'll receive $40 million in an FLI fund, and that's a grant that'll go towards the cost of the land itself. And so the nations want to participate, even with the developer, although he is fully responsible for all the cash and all the guarantees. Nations do bring funds to the table through these initiatives. So, and again, what I worry about is how long these initiatives will last. But for the nations now, what it's done is that MST, I would argue that MST is one of the top developers in Canada. And it's a really good turn for nations that they will be major developers in the city of Vancouver and also give back through attainable housing, attainable rental, and social housing. So thank you very much.
For either of our panelists here today, please feel free to post it into the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. It'd be fantastic. The one that's come up that I'll post here. Thank you. Once the 99-year lease is up, how does the lease extension negotiation look like? Costs, typical lump sum for the prepaid option by owners, or is it looking like a 99 and then zero option to extend, reversionary type planning?
Yeah, I would say this is probably going to be a non-extension, but there is an opening in there that we can extend with the developer. But the developers come in and fully understand that they're in this for 99 years. And the one thing I should have said, with the social housing, this is important to note too, because when the developer leaves, he's out right now. So he's out at the end of that 99 year. But the nations own all the social housing. This is, I'm sorry I missed that, but the nations in these deals, because they're a government, they will own all the social housing and they'll own a large amount of the attainable rental. And so where the developer is heavily involved is in the market, housing, and the retail. But at the end of 99 years, there will be a discussion, but the developer knows it's highly likely that he will be out of that project at the end of 99 years.
Well, if I could respond to that as well, Graham, one of the work I've done, we use the UBC and Simon Fraser lease model, which does have conditions for renewal at the end. And we found that mitigates the discount between leasehold and freehold. And it's totally at the option of the nation, whether they'll renew or they pay out the depreciated value of the improvements that are on the land.
And I guess kind of taking this into the, just carrying on this line, should there be, now the nations have very, very long-term thinking, and I'm sure partnering with longer-term thinking groups as developers, but perhaps the developers do change or the owners do change their horizons, things happen. Is there that capability built in such that the nations can stay in while the partnership does change after it's been built?
In our case, the nations stay in fully. But again, correctly, the nations stay in no matter what. They stay fully through the development going forward, and then at the end of the lease, the developer is out, and then they can negotiate that lease longer, depending on the structure, how the buildings are. Vancouver's a bit different than the rest of the world, where there's very few of our larger buildings that are 100 years old. So the nations wanted to make sure that they have that power to make that decision at the end of that lease.
Yeah, Graham, they have the underlying ownership, so they're constantly in control.
Exactly.
Yeah. There are assignment provisions within the lease, but they must be approved by the nations as well. So they never relinquish control.
Yeah.
Okay, and when it comes to the social housing component, would you say that those are they in separate airspace parcels or contained units, or sprinkled throughout the development? I'm sure this may vary depending, but how would that kind of look?
Yeah, in our model, that's a good question. In our model, we've been in negotiations with the City of Vancouver. We really would like to keep it as airspace parcels, separate buildings. And you know that the city likes to intertwine a bit more, but we're saying like it's going to be scattered throughout the development. It's not in one section of the development, both in all our projects, and that they would be airspace parcels. And so there would be we're trying not to have social housing built into the same building as market housing. And it's really just for the reason of the way that this deal is set in place is much easier for us at that point in time. The nations will own that and run that as a government.
Okay, and another question posed would be for David. Can you please elaborate on how you obtain the land at 30% of the market value?
So what we do is, like, I bring my clients with me. And I can tell you that this has been an ongoing difficult. I've never had to negotiate like this in my life. It's been extremely difficult, but it's been extremely successful. So lands today, I'll give you an example. Lands today in Vancouver, if you're going to go out, and let's just look at Fairmont. You're going to go out and purchase Fairmont today. You're as freehold, you're probably looking at a minimum of $350 a foot. So through rights and title and recognition and accommodation, the nations negotiate with the federal government. And because that was federal land, that was through Canada Land Corporation. And we said, look, you have to recognize that this was nations' lands. My clients, when we started out, my mandate was, David, go get this, and we're not paying a penny for the land, we're taking it back. We all knew that wasn't going to happen. So then what we did is through negotiations with the government team, we looked at the project. We took into consideration that the nations could have gone to court and got this land back. And believe me, there were many times that it almost broke off and that they said, we're going to court and we'll go to the Supreme Court, because at that time, no one had lost in the Supreme Court of Canada. No nation had ever lost. But better heads prevailed, and we came up with value so that the 30% was the accommodation that was given to the nations because of rights and title and recognition that that's obviously their land. And that was just through hard negotiation is all I can tell you. There was no set number in place. And then we also negotiated the price of the land based on recognition, accommodation, and rights and title. We negotiated that number. So
excellent. And another question that's been posed here, what have the negotiations with the City of Vancouver in terms of density and inclusionary zoning been like so far?
Another good question. The same battle. I would say this, Vancouver has been, the federal government in Vancouver have been excellent to work with. And all joking aside, they've recognized the nations as a government. And I can tell you that our densities are much higher than what we thought. You know, the nations, and with a caveat for the person that asked that question, we started out, we were ready to put this land into reserve. It wasn't going well. And this is an example I'll use is Willingdon in Burnaby. So under the old government, the old mayor, we got nowhere, absolutely nowhere. We were at 800,000 square feet of commercial. That was what that 40 acres was zoned for. We got absolutely nowhere. Under the new election, a new mayor came in, new councillors, we ended up at 4 million square feet. And that's what I mean. It really depends on who you're dealing with. In Vancouver, we ended up at about a 2.8 FSR for Fairmont. We'll probably end up at 3. And we fully expect we're going to end up at a 3 FSR on Jericho of about 11.5 million square feet. But, you know, the nations hold the power. When I bring the 3, without the nations, I would have never got the density that I got on Jericho, or especially, on Jericho especially. We wouldn't have got that. And that was really having the 3 chiefs in the room and negotiating heavily with the mayor. But I can say this, that the City of Vancouver recognizes the First Nations as a government, and the negotiations and the zoning have been very, very good.
Excellent. I think that's really promising. I think there's a lot of people that have different opinions of their experiences with the city.
Oh, yeah.
That's really good to hear.
Yeah. Well, if I was under my own, I could tell you I'd probably be using some foul language right now. But no, the nations, there's the respect is there between the governments and the nations right now. You know, the NDP government has been difficult. I'll say that. It's just, you know, we're making progress, but our negotiations there, the land costs that we paid for Jericho West was extremely higher than the land costs we paid for the federal government in Jericho East. And so we're under further negotiations to try and change that now. But again, it really depends on who you're dealing with in government.
I could just add to that in terms of the power that the First Nations have. And there was a little project I worked with Musqueam in Vancouver, and that was the Milltown Marina down at the end of Granville Street. And it was a partnership between a private sector developer and Musqueam. And the private sector developer approached Musqueam And he'd been working to try to get this marina approved for over 5 years. And there hadn't been a marina approved in over 20 years. And so he brought Musqueam in. It was in a location that was very precious to them, near their Cessnock village of 4,000 years. And we ended up getting the approval within 24 months. And the developer was prepared to give up equity in the project, recognizing the power that Musqueam brought to the table. And you'll also find that a number of progressive municipalities, Vancouver is one, have protocol agreements with these nations. And it doesn't mean you get around the rules, but they become a lot more accommodating in terms of the process and cooperation with you.
You know, Howie, that's a good point you're making, because an example being Terry Huey on, I worked with Terry for years, on St. Paul's. He came to the Three Nations on the old St. Paul's site, and the nations were partners. A lot of people don't know that. We're actually partners with Concord Pacific on St. Paul's, and that was a deal that Terry did not have to come as partners. So we're seeing a lot of that at MSTDC right now, with developers who recognize the advantages of working with the First Nations.
That's really good to hear. And I guess one topic that's kind of come up a little bit is a little lobbying going on for the 2030 Winter Games. And there's been some comments out about the nations, the host nations that previously were integral, forming a larger component. And I would imagine a huge component of the Olympics is the real estate, both from a legacy and infrastructure perspective. Unless you're bound, I guess, is there any truth to some rumors there, or?
How you want to answer that?
Well, whose truth do you want to hear, Greg?
Oh, that sounds even better. I like it.
No, the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver was a great example of providing universal recognition of First Nations, their culture, their history, and the Aboriginal pavilion that was in front of the QE Theatre. You see the lineups down the block to get into that. International visitors were just blown away by the opening and closing ceremonies. So I think there will be an interest in part of the First Nations, but I think there'll also be caution, because Olympic Games or any of these extravaganzas are money pits, and they'll be quite cautious in how they approach it. But certainly they would look to have a similar role in terms of recognizing as being the original residents in British Columbia and Canada, and being having their culture and their existence recognized.
Well, I'll take it a different track here with a question that just came in. Maybe Howie and David, I'll let you kind of see who would like to tackle this one. What do you recommend when working in an area where there are multiple nations in terms of
individually, to ensure that, number one, they were supporting it, and that's no different in development. I mean, if I was doing that today and it was a multi-project that you had to go out and get the support of, say, 3 or 4 or 5 nations, number one, have patience. It's going to take time, because in each nation, when you meet them, they're going to have to go through chief, council, and membership. And really, at the end of the day, like I stated in my talk, you really want to get to membership in those nations, because if you get the support of membership, that project will be successful. I've seen many deals in Vancouver where the support of chief and council were there, and then they fell out of favor and those deals tankered. So I think that you have to, one, have a very patient approach. Number 2, go in and meet each nation. And then number 3, if that's successful and you have memberships on board, then you can bring those 3 or 4 or 5 nations together. You know, an example being how difficult it is. Up north, we had 24 of the 26 nations on board. and we didn't get it. It was delayed, and then the government changed, and of course, then it fell apart when NDP came in. But without 2 of those nations, we weren't successful, and that's how difficult it can be. If you didn't have 1 here of 3, I don't think you'll survive.
If I could add to that, David, I was involved when the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish formed an alliance, and it centered around the General Post Office in Vancouver. And frankly, at that time, they didn't like each other very much, and they were very competitive. And so it really came down to the leadership that they had. And Ernie Campbell was the chief of Musqueam, Leonard George, chief of Tsleil-Waututh, and Gibby Jacobs led Squamish. And they were just great leaders. They said, well, shall we continue war, or shall we work collaboratively to do something for our community and for our membership? And that was the start of a partnership that's grown into something that no one ever thought it would be. It was supposed to be a one-off and never to be replicated. Well, what do you say to that, David?
I'm busy. Yeah. No, but it's a great story, Howie. You're right. It's a great story. From where none of them got along. They did not get along, right? So they saw the economic benefits and they saw the economic benefits, the cultural benefits, and the social benefits.
That was the conversation that went around the table. Say it's really us against them,
yeah,
rather than having them play us off against each other.
Yeah, and Howie, that's a really important point, because in our development agreements we have between the nations and our developer, as long as the 3 nations stick together, then they have the power in that development. That's really important. And it's the same just with all governments. They're still looking for these nations not to get along, and they'll delay everything they can, right? And the other most important thing that you're talking about is when MST sticks together, it makes it very difficult for other nations in the Lower Mainland to come in and make claims against those nations. If they were on their own, it could be very difficult, but that's the strength of MST right now. They haven't had a lot of claims from other nations coming on the lands that they're developing.
Well, I guess another question that came in, just kind of getting close to time here, but has MST considered promoting home ownership opportunities for members who can qualify for mortgages?
100%. In our deal, we have units set aside in all our properties. Units are set aside for nations members. That was extremely important. And that the developer has provided funding, takes some of his profits to provide funding for those, so that nation's members can afford it. And so another very good question. And it's not minor in terms of the housing itself. Again, I can't disclose all the numbers, but it's fairly substantial housing for members on all our sites. That's LDB, Willingdon, and Fairmont, and Jericho. And again, that was a deal that we did with a developer.
Oh, excellent. Well, we've come up on the full hour here. Definitely want to thank you both very much for the insights and the depth of discussion and details surrounding a lot of the incredible work you've been doing with the nations and how they've developed, and some of the stories that have come along. I'm sure there's even more. I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I want to thank again CMLS Financial for sponsoring today's session. Very much. Thank you, Sam, for leading us in. And also, if those that can attend, we do have a couple of channels open for post-webinar minglers the links were sent out earlier, yesterday. So that's through Microsoft Teams. If you're able to make it, it's great to have those supplemental discussions. So very much again, thank you very much, David and Howie, for volunteering your time and your experience. For everyone, I think, I know I've learned a lot, and I think based on a lot of the questions that have come up that have come about, I think our membership and audience has very much benefited from your help here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.